Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for your patience. This is the fourth event of the virtual symposium, Recursive Colonialism, Artificial Intelligence and Speculative Computation. We are the Critical Computation Bureau, a collective of researchers, artists and writers working at the intersection of technology and culture, computer science and information theory, aesthetics and politics. Recursive Colonialism, Artificial Intelligence and Speculative Computation 2020 aims to provide interventions in the technopolitics of racial capitalism and its recursive regeneration, mixing together critical and creative practices and borrowing models and methods from philosophy of technology, Black studies, political theory, computer science, and information theory, as well as media aesthetics, cultural, and digital media theory. Please check our manifesto on the website and the social text online publication, Control Societies at 30, Technopolitical Forces and Ontologies of Difference. We also thank Duke University, which has sponsored this symposium, together with UPenn and l'Università di Napoli L'Orientale. For more information on this project and to contact us, feel free to check our website, www.recursivecolonialism.com, and to follow our socials. My name is Luciana Parisi. My co-facilitator today is Oana Parvin. We've called this fourth day of the symposium episode 03, Hunting, Blackness and Algorithmic Thought. And we have associated today's dialogue with a series of screenings, namely Francois Notz's Core Dump Dakar, and Delia Dayemo and Christopher Oliver, The Cosmogony of Racial Capitalism. You are invited to watch these pieces of video art on our website, which will find them accompanied by original text written by our curators, Alessandra Ferlito and Olga Solombrino, as well as by Dele Adeyemo and Christopher Oliver. The format of this session will be the following. Our guests will talk for 20 minutes each, then 10 minutes each. After that, the speakers will address a few questions that you can type in your Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please remember to state clearly which speaker your question is addressed to. Our co-facilitator will pick up as many questions as possible, and the chair will address them to the panelists. I also want to remind all the speakers today not to check the Q&A box, as all questions will be verbally asked by the chair. Please type in your question in the Q&A box at any time of the session. This session is also streamed live on our YouTube channel. Today, we are very proud to host a dialogue between our guests, Ramon Amaro and Ezekiel Dixon-Román. Ramon Amaro is a lecturer in art and visual cultures of the Global South, Department of History of Art at UCL. His work revolves around speculative articulations in machine learning, philosophies of being, mathematics, engineering, and Black ontology. Ezekiel Dixon-Román is director of the Master of Science in Social Policy program, chair of the Data Analytics for Social Policy Certificate of the Master of Science in Social Policy program at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of Inheriting Possibility, Social Reproduction and Quantification in Education. He is also co-edited Thinking Comprehensively About Education, Spaces of Educative Possibility and Their Implications for Public Policy. And is also edited the issue Alternative Ontologies of Number, Rethinking the Quantitative in Computational Culture. And finally, the computational turn in education research, critical and creative perspectives on the digital data deluge. We are proud today to have both Ramon and Ezekiel, and we both welcome them. I will now give the word to Ezekiel Dixon-Román, who will start our dialogue today. Thank you.
Greetings, and allow me to first extend my appreciation to Luciana Parisi for her introduction, Oana Parvan and Brian Diaquino for their impeccable work in helping to organize this symposium, and also to Ramon Amaro for being in conversation with me today. I not only have great admiration for Ramon's work, I also think our scholarship is very much so akin. Thus, I've been looking forward to this conversation. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I'd like to begin with an example that Luciana Parisi mentioned in her talk on Tuesday that is based on the recent New York Times article, Designed to Deceive. Do these people look real? Do these people look real to you? Where generative adversarial networks are being employed to produce new human faces that can be, toggled to range in age, eyes, mood, perspective, gender, and race ethnicity. As Luciana poignantly argued, the variation of these faces is scaled based on the recursive unfolding of difference into universal or Promethean man. Today, I'd like to use this example to provocate a set of propositions on haunting. I'm particularly interested in examining how time and space configure into these computational iterations of human faces, faces that are said to not be real, yet are based on the deterritorialized and reterritorialized individual data of human faces. Thus, in these deep fake faces are the disjointedness or discontinuities that mark the spectral immanence of the actual human faces in the present. I will refer to this example throughout my comments today, toggling the computationally produced variation of human faces. Ontology is a concept that has long been of interest for cultural theorists. Ontology in particular was Jacques Derrida's deconstructive intervention on ontology. Ontology arguably encompassed much of Derrida's deconstructive concepts: the trace, difference with an A, the supplement, absence of presence, among others. Ontology, a play on the pronunciation of ontology, points to the non-full, non-total presence of being. That in every being, there's always already an absence of presence, an inheritance, a trace of that which was and that which is to come. In every being, there is a haunting. While Derrida engaged haunting and ontology in various areas of his work, it was in Spectres of Marx where Derrida most famously developed ontology as a deconstructive intervention on Marxism. This was a long-awaited intervention given Derrida's engagement with many other areas of thought, like structuralism and phenomenology. And some have argued that even this intervention did not address Marx's historical materialism. It is here where he famously draws a quote from Hamlet to refer to haunting or spectrality. That is, quote, the time is out of joint, end quote. In other words, it is the disjointedness or disadjustedness in time that indicate the presence of a ghost that sees us, but we are not able to see it. Others have taken up haunting, building on Derrida's theoretical developments of hauntology. As Avery Gordon states, open quote, in haunting, organized forces and systemic structures that appear removed from us make their impact felt in everyday life in a way that confounds our analytic separation and confounds the social separation themselves, end quote. The haunting works in the gap of the seeming discontinuity between social structures and social institutions and everyday life. Similarly, for Barad, hauntings are, open quote, a disorienting experience of the disjointedness of time and space, entanglements of here and there, now and then, a ghostly sense of discontinuity, end quote. Additionally, as Mark Fisher points out, hauntology is also about technology and the temporalities of technology that produce a virtuality, a relation to what is no longer and not yet. Teletechnologies in particular mark a collapsing of both time and space, shaping affects of nostalgia or anticipation. Again, the disjointedness of time and space affectively shape and indicate the present spectrality. It is this time or temporality that I want to focus on today. For Derrida, time was signified through the sign, a mark of the complicated and non-full presence of a ghost. I want to offer some propositions today toward rethinking time and haunting. its relation to recursion, and with Denise Ferreira da Silva, I want to think through the political ethical work of time, especially in relation to the problem of colonial articulations in the development of the human. Finally, I'd like to leave us with some considerations of what a Black feminist poetics thinking might offer us toward addressing, redressing, and or rerouting the fears, anxieties, desires, and anticipations of the political affect of the no longer / what happened, and the not yet / what's yet to happen. So I'd like to show one another aspect of this article where we see the toggling of faces, for instance, over age. Toggling the New York Times deep fake faces raises questions about how time and space is configured and enfolded into the curation of these digital productions. As Elisa Giardina Papa illustrated for us yesterday, the generation of data for training affective computing is temporally and spatially situated, particularly in the global South, yet also processed by a technology that was developed from 19th century phonology and assumptions of the transparent or liberal subject. Thus, racial logics become part of the nonlinear axiomatics of the technology. This materializes in part due to the temporal spatial situating of the subject and assumptions of development, progress, and narratives of cultural difference. It is for these reasons that I'd like to offer some propositions on temporality and by entanglement, spatiality. Through these propositions, I hope to 1, move beyond the modern categories of past, present, and future. 2, shift the theoretical gaze from the signifier to the becoming process and its material reconfigurings, and as such, 3, open up the potential for an alternative conceptualization of haunting that's based on the inheritance of colonial violence and racial subjugation, what Spillers has characterized as the intergenerationality of hieroglyphics of the flesh. Let me begin by saying the obvious, that linear teleological time does not exist. Discrete categories of past, present, and future are inherited categories of modernism that were constituted by the interest in progress and development of colonialism and capitalism. According to Whitehead, all there is are conceptual prehensions and persuasions of the future in the supposed immediate present. The past is imminent in the present. The what happened and the no longer are enfolded in the present, encoding the fleshiness of bodily and technosocial systems. Whether it's the neurobiological or neural network, the sociogenic code becomes reinforced through the spiraling feedback loops of recursion. As described by Mark Fisher, the haunting of the past is instantiated in the disorienting experience of déjà vu or nostalgia, where the past is imminent in the immediate occasion or event initiating the coding of the flesh. The future is also imminent in the present. It is a virtual and what shapes affective anticipations and the constructive political necessity for algorithmic future prehension via prediction. The past is imminent in the future. It is future's past. The virtual becomes actual and the actual is shaped by the virtual. From the anticipation of the virtual, the not yet, the what is yet to happen, haunts the event toward what Masumi has called preemptive logics of power. Cybernetic predictions of the virtual are the preemptive logics of algorithmic governance that shape and become the actual. In other words, cybernetic predictive acts form the becoming actual that is haunted by future's past. I'm reminded here of a passage from one of Claudia Rankine's prose in Citizen, where she says, quote, "You know feelings destabilize since everyone you ask is laughing that kind of close the gap laughter. All the ha-has wanting uninterrupted views. Don't be ridiculous. None of the other Black friends feel that way. And how you feel is how you feel even if what you perceive isn't tied to what is. What is? And so it goes until the vista includes only displacement of feeling back into the body, which gave birth to the feelings that don't sit comfortably inside the communal. You smile dumbly at the world because you are still feeling, if only the feeling could be known. And this brings on the moment you recognize as desire. End quote. Desire here is that which is the pursuit of knowability, recognition of affect, and even the potentiality of subversion. Yet desire is also that which is already slipping the grasp of the present, becoming future's past. The present is the heir of both the conceptual or perceived past and future. Replacing the category of history in Masumi's characterization of a history in the present, I restate this as a becoming process in the present, an affective becoming and material reconfiguring of encoded flesh. Yet, to be clear, the haunting presence is not colonial reason or whiteness, nor is it the creative indeterminacies of blackness or the flesh. Haunting, I argue, is the disjuncture or disjointedness that instantiates the recursive system's inheritance and unfolding of colonial violence and racial subjugation. It is precisely the temporal skip or spatial discontinuity in the becoming recursive process as seen in the moving image of recursive colonialism on the symposium website, or the disadjustments of the toggled shifts in the deepfake faces. Just to give another example here. And with Parisi, it is that which is working in the interval between the finite system and the incomputable infinities. It is the tension that's produced from the system's recursive efforts to self-regulate and maintain the changing same of colonial reason or whiteness in the face of the incompressibility of the creative indeterminacies of blackness or the flesh, what Césaire called the colonialist encounter in computational logics. Time is a fundamental part of the feedback loops from outputs to inputs in a recursive system. It is via the temporal process that recursion is not simply looping back on itself, but rather opens up to self-regulate and maintain a homeostatic system while processing contingencies, producing a spiraling process of recursivity. Recursion is a computational process of unfolding temporalities. According to Yukui, indeterminacies characterize not just recursive temporalities, but also recursive thinking. The halting problem of the incompressibility of what Gregory Shaitan has called omega and Parisi's incomputable is an instantiation of recursive haunting. The skipping of the incompressibility of indeterminacies is the appropriative logic of capital, seeking to compress indeterminacies into colonialist reason. In what ways do we see the recursive logics of the New York Times deepfake faces unfolding temporal spatial territories of political symbolic matter? How is what Ramon has called the Black technical object configured or not configured in and shaping the computational production of these faces? And just to give two more examples here, one of race and ethnicity, and the second one that they call gender, which I would argue there's an element of intersectionality here. As I've mentioned earlier, history, time, and space, as in geography, were important in shaping categories of difference. As Denise Ferreira da Silva argues, it is through the temporalizing of categories via Hegel's and Herder's natural history of racial categories that produces sociopolitical logics of raciality. It is via Herder's account of human history as situated in varying geographical contexts where he develops his conceptualization of the development of the interiority of human groups via their overcome achievements. Regarding Hegel, da Silva states that he replaces Herder's nature with the Father Spirit, open quote, Father Spirit, a gesture that further apprehends the world as the exhibition hall of an entity that belongs in time, an interior thing. There he finds that spirit had not done its work on African minds and territories, for the Negro lacked the ideas that registered the spirit's presence, end quote. Through Herder's and Hegel's move to make natural history and the spirit the causal force of development of a group's interior capacities, they cemented colonial ideas of progress and development, and as such the manifestation of sameness and difference via what Winter has called man one and man two, or the cosmogonies of prototypical man. Consequently, time is not the only dimension in which haunting makes its appearance or apparition known, but as a significant But as a significant premise in the conceptualization of the post-Enlightenment subject, time is also profoundly important for the spectrality of colonial violence and racial subjugation. In fact, time, history, and space, as demarcated by geographic context, are more specifically development became the necessary descriptors in the formations of sameness and difference, as well as economic conditions, social conditions, human capacities, and even frameworks that inform social policies and practices of governance. Thus, that which is out of joint or disadjusted is always a haunting imbued with the political ethical concerns of colonial violence. As a result, the temporal skipping, spatial shift or blur, and political symbolic ambiguity of the deep fake faces mark the apparitions of the transparent subject of the post-Enlightenment. While I argue that haunting is the complicated unfolding of the affective patterns of the no longer and anticipations of the not yet that maintains or reinforces the changing same of the transparent subject, I also posit haunting as a condition of possibility. That is to say, the fact of the apparition's presence, its seething presence, demands address, redress, and or rerouting. I want to begin suggesting the importance of Black feminist poetics here and how it can strengthen the conjuring work of diffraction. In Denise Ferreira da Silva's articulation of a Black feminist poetics, she seeks to push a thinking and reading without modern categories. In fact, she pushes us to consider how modern categories, especially of time, history, or development, have shaped the text or an event, and as such, to address the colonial and racial subjugation. Paying attention to the total value of the founding violence of global capital, this is a practice of thinking and reading that forces one to locate or identify the haunting logics of what happened that's imminent in the what happens, how the what happens anticipates the what is yet to happen, and how the what happened is already imminent in the what is yet to happen. By thinking the world as plenum, one can begin to image the transversability, traversability, and transubstantiality of the deep fake faces. The discontinuities and disjunctures of the deep fake faces are the diffractive patterns that are residual from the generative adversarial network's output. Borrowing from Barad's articulation, diffraction is the way in which wave patterns overlap and how waves bend and spread when they encounter an interfering structure, producing differences that make a difference. The processed visual facial data are diffracted through generative adversarial networks algorithms to produce the faces. The blurred spot, the mismatched accessories, such as earrings, the blurred out background, or the symmetry of the on average asymmetrical faces are the diffractive wave patterns left in the wake of Gann's attempts to compress that which is incompressible, such as its inability to reconcile the psychic, open quote, reconcile the psychic potential of the racialized individual with that of a predetermined technical structure, end quote, what Ramon Amaro calls the Black technical object. These diffractive wave patterns in the wake of Gann's political symbolic formations of faces also points toward the potentiality of computationally identifying, undoing, exorcising, or conjuring the bodies of the racial other in their diffractive wake. Through the computational identification of the diffractive wave patterns of temporal spatial disjoint, I argue opens up the possibility of a Black feminist poetical reading of the haunting unfoldings of recursive logics. In other words, by identifying the discontinuities and disjointedness, it enables a reading of what happened, what happened, what happens, and what is yet to happen, that occasions a potential address, undoing or unmaking of the instituted violence that brought it into emergence. It is through such interventions that we might identify, exercise, or conjure instances, moments, and openings toward redressing, or more radically rerouting or refusing the colonial and racial subjugation haunting our present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ezekiel. It was wonderful. I would like now to pass the microphone or the image to Ramon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luciana, for that very generous introduction. I also want to first also thank Oana Parvin, Brian Diaquino, and all the other participants in the Critical Computation Bureau. And also like to thank, especially for hosting this event, Duke University and the University of Penn. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. And I'll save for last my absolute admiration for Ezekiel Dixon-Román. Wow, that was an incredible talk, and I gained a lot, and hopefully we can get a lot of the conversation. I have many questions for you, but it's not often that you have the opportunity to engage with someone that that you admire so much as a scholar and consider a friend. So this is a great pleasure to be here with you all. I'll get started because time is limited, and then hopefully we can, during the question and answer, we can start to unpack some of these ideas. So willing to do that afterwards, but I'll just get started. The following reflections concern the mode of Black existence, or more so, what I contend is the necessity to re-articulate the notion of Black existence and its representative commitment to the history and identity as the language through which one is to comprehend Black being from within the algorithmic. I invite us to reflect on what Simondon describes as the meaningful awareness of the mode of existence of technical objects as brought forth in philosophical thought, and more so, bring to the fore how this awareness circulates within other awarenesses of one's own racial objecthood. In other words, I want to bring to attention the method by which those of us concerned with the mode of being at the juncture of between ourselves as human and the technical or algorithmic as non-human, and how we might extend an awareness into the ontological consequences of a mode of Black existence within what Sylvia Wynter calls the substance of race. According to Wynter, the substance of race is the grasping of being as that which already unifies racial perception with the staging of white European power over the stranger. The substance of race constitutes an ordering of the world through the image of white supremacy as a precondition for the structuring of society. Here, the characteristics of whiteness, what we might call the ideal state or the good form, is descended to the apex of human value. To take Wynter's claim at face value is to build awareness towards a discursive opposition between human and non-human being, between the white Westerner and the stranger, which presumes an absence of Black reality in the category of species, and furthermore, ignores a Black reality within its technical creation, or what for the purposes of this event we might call the technical object or the algorithmic. While Wynter proposes that this ontological scandal, as Alessandro Rango describes it, is an inequitable system of value organized around the principles of Black non-being and action through the epistemic, Simondon encourages us to incorporate technical being, in this case the algorithmic, in the form of knowledge and in the form of a sense of values for more fully realized reality. Simondon argues that to actualize this reality, we must first fulfill our duty towards the affirmation of the value of each living and non-living being, one analogous to the abolition of slavery, a reality that is aware that the opposition between human machine is a false claim that carries no foundation, similar to Wynter's skillful deconstruction of humanism brought forth the Western values of ignorance and resentment within racialized ecologies. Simondon's equal condemnation of humanism, what he describes as a facile reality, masks, as he argues, quote, a reality rich in human efforts and natural forces, and which constitutes a world of technical objects as mediators between man and nature, end quote. Simondon further posits that this facile reality is exacerbated by a, quote, culture that behaves towards the technical object as man towards a stranger, when he allows himself to be carried away by his primitive xenophobia, end quote. I want to consider this collision of ideas whereby the grasping of a more comprehensive human techno-reality might be useful for a genuine awareness of a Black being as well as technical being, what I have called in other spaces the Black technical object. This awareness of the Black technical object is a reciprocal relation of value, as well as the initiation of self-actualization. It is how one might proceed through the expansion of actualization within the algorithmic, and not through the deeply disquieting and disturbing effects of race and racism. I want to pursue this disturbing effect of race as a type of haunting, or regular visitor to the certain place of Black existence, that which is the principal source of alienation and the reestablishment of regulative data and information. More so, I want to consider the manner in which this haunting might reinforce the discursive opposition between human and stranger, leading to the critique of certain myths and stereotypes under the facile illusion of an always already existing set of linguistic conditions, or of a, quote, perfect automata at the service of a lazy and fulfilled humanity, end quote, as Simondon writes, which I argue actively seeks whiteness as the organizing principle through which any computational knowledge is or can be understood. As Ezekiel Dixon-Román argues, the constructed myths and narratives of the ontological origins of the human and the later narratives of man produces not just a hegemony of the human, but also of his social technical assemblages of data, as it is ultimately this historicity that materializes in the episteme and the techne of the social technical assemblages that enable the emergence of data. In Ghostly Matters, Avery Gordon presents, quote, if haunting describes how that which appears to be not there is often a seething presence, acting on and often meddling with taken for granted realities, the ghost is just the sign, or the empirical evidence, if you like, that tells you a haunting is taking place. The ghost is not simply a dead or missing person, but a social figure, and investigating it can lead to the dense site where history and subjectivity make social life. The reality of this genesis that Gordon describes enables us to grasp the coordination of four elements, that of presence, that of reality, that of evidence, and that of the social figure in the making of social life. In order to raise this awareness, Gordon draws upon the specter as that which makes an evidentiary claim to the faint reality of a disembodied experience. It, in a way, describes the trace and its evidentiary power as an element of an ensemble that rewards the degradation of energy in the making of reality, whereby life expresses itself as a dense site of memory and residues of what's left behind. While this modification of the philosophical notion of Black presence announces one's awakening from a type of historical coma, it also announces the possibility of introducing a form of knowledge that structures itself as an analogy between two operations of individuation. In this way, being can be known by means of knowledge of the pre-individual or the ghost. In doing so, knowledge is nothing more or less than the transfer of information between distinct yet indistinguishable entities. On the other hand, the specter becomes the stranger that precedes the knowledge of the subject, who reflects upon itself in the construction of its reality, whereby knowledge is contained in a preliminary logic that seeks to prove beforehand that being is individuated in one possible manner, in this case, history. Instead, we must exhume the individual from an unlawful enunciation, that is, as being already individuated as subject or object or ghost of the past. A theory of being must be introduced that is anterior to all logics of category. This theory would provide the grounds for a more adequate logic, underwritten by the fact that there is nothing that proves beforehand that being has been individuated in one coherent manner or another. It is possible, to the contrary, that what we know as history of the self is comprised of multiple individuations existing together, though in different temporalities and various intensities. What if this multivalent array of individuations all alter one another reciprocally, which would require us to think of each of these specters as modes of individuation in modulating expression of becoming being, each equally real in their own as well as their relational domains within the fact of their inequality and incoherence. Now, to return to race, then, is to grasp Black being as a multivalent array of incomplete processes of being and becoming, whereby the trace of the ghost of a racialized past provides access to merely one mode of being in an infinite assemblage of reciprocal processes of individuation. Grasping at one straw, as they say, is no more an indication of the depths of reality as that which has already been externally prescribed. Developing an awareness of a more comprehensive process of Black being then necessitates a release from the primitive ideas of the deviant, the other, and the non-human stranger that is excluded and quarantined from the category human. Instead, we must reject a grammar that emphasizes the supposed innateness of language, the languages of race, whereby language can disindividuate itself. In other words, it must reject the relation between beings as a sign of pure expression, moving beyond subjective expressiveness by grasping the signification of a collective individuation. Muriel Combs describes this process as that which provokes a, quote, putting into question of the subject that necessarily takes the form of a momentary loosening of the hold of constituted individuality, which is engulfed by the pre-individual, end quote. I have argued elsewhere that this disindividuation might bring us closer to what I call the Black technical object, whereby the psychic awareness of a multivalent array of individuating processes of becoming takes into equal value the continual becoming of an algorithmic awareness. This shift in pathological perspective from one of entropy and lack to a more affirmative process of psychic generation helps us develop a human techno-existence that would, at its origin, substitute the view of computational duress to one of Black totality, always already in the process of future transmutation. The resultant incompatibility could then be seen as an act of thought, that which brings forth pre-existing substances of racialization. It also makes use of this duress to catalyze future affirmative iterations of the self. Ultimately, what is prioritized within this psychic encounter is a compassion for the self as always already whole at the encounter of artificial misrecognition, a self that is pre-individuated and continually taking shape as Blackness has always done, in its explorations of the infinite halls of possible ways of being and becoming Black. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. Both of you guys, there's a lot of food for thought, but I think we can start by asking some questions. I don't see any question in the chat box. Yes.
So I was going to say, Luciana,
we need to do the 10 minutes. Sorry.
Or you know, I was even going to suggest, Ramon, I rather than doing the sort of the structured 10-minute, I almost want to just have a dialogue with you on this, right? So, and I'll start us off here. So first of all, thank you for the rich provocations that you provided, but also the bringing in Simondon and even the question of the individual, and especially even in relation to the Black technical object, as you've so sharply articulated and developed in engaging Fanon and others. So there's a couple things I want to sort of engage you on and just almost get a further elucidation and engagement on. So one is you talk about the post-individual in sort of two, excuse me, not the pre-individual in two forms, right? So on the one hand, there's you talk about the individuation of being can be known by means of the knowledge of the past individual. And then you also talk about the operation of individuation via the specters become the stranger that precedes the knowledge of the subject. And I'm wondering, so this is one might characterize as sort of the almost pre, or even that which was, or even a kind of what happened, if you will, that is shaping individuation. But I'm wondering about that, how you see individuation playing out in a kind of anticipation of not yet, or even what I might characterize, or what you might call, what I started to call initially and mix my words up, a post-individual, if you will. Is there, what might you think about a post-individual that is shaping individuation, if you will? I could pose a couple more, or we could just go back and forth with however you want to.
Do you mind if we start there?
Yeah, let's do that.
I want to really thank you. I mean, it's actually a pleasure to be in dialogue with you. In many ways, what you've just picked up on, that point of the pre-individual, is something that literally has been haunting me for years. And seeing how that actually functions when we're talking about the historicity of the body of difference. And this sort of reconciliation with, Simondon's sort of engagement with structuralism, which of course we know at this time is just predominantly thinking about whiteness as the body in which unfolds into being, and then Fanon comes in and is trying to actually articulate then what is the racialized body that actually unfolds. And we see these sort of limitations, of course, with Fanon. He has that tension. And I'll get back to Simondon in a second. So Fanon has that tension because in one sense, he wants to create this radical new human. He wants to dismantle these perceptual pre-individual states in order to sort of project this new human there. But then he's also committed to the body in which he's unfolding. Of course, this is a product of him being on the ground, in this colonial struggle. And so you see that tension play out, especially in Black Skin, White Mass, where in one sense he has to let go, in another sense he can't let go, because that which is already known is in this colonial type of structure. And the cost is too high, right?
Right.
And we know this as Black folks. The cost is too high of dismantling an entire scope of categorical identity, because then what gets lost, the potential of what gets lost, are the specters of the past, which have already gone on to inform our pre-individuated states, right? They're valuable. This is valuable knowledge, which has kept us alive, across generations. But then when you engage with Simondon, so Simondon for me just becomes a sort of affirmative version of Fanon that allows a sort of multivalent idea of what Blackness might mean. And having this pre-individuated state that is not one that is already known. So saying, okay, well, I know this specter from my past as this sort of fully whole, solidified figure, which is how we treat Black history, right? We presume we know the slave. We presume we know, by knowing the event, we assume we know the individuated individuals. And then we encapsulate them into the category of trauma and death and life. And then we have attempts of fugitivity, so on and so forth. But see, we still are solidifying these individuals as if they themselves didn't have a multivalent perspective in individuation. And so I start to question of, am I doing the service of whiteness by recategorizing my historical specter as already being formed within the perception of whiteness itself? And if I do that, you see, but the tension is, if I completely unravel that, then what are we left with today? We're still left with the duress and trauma. And I think that's that important part of anticipation you're talking about. And so in a way, what I'm sort of provoking in the Black technical object, what I'm provoking is in making use of that anticipation in the Simondonian sense, not for recognition of the past, because basically every time we wake up, every time we breathe, we recognize the past. It's already there. not to deconstruct those specters, but use that duress of the specters, which is always already present in the body of difference, to then inform the next transmutation. So that's where you project in the future. So I'm trying to sort of cut this obsession, and not in a negative sense, but this obsession that the past is that which I need to circumvent.
Right, or even traverse, if I may. Yeah.
Right, or even right.
Yeah. I'm drawn to this. This affirmative process of psychic. Is it generation that you use? Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that in that is a kind of a traversing, but even a moving, even a desiring toward something else. But may I ask, where does that something else even come from? Right. So if whiteness is always right there lurking in anticipation, right, where does that alternative, that something else, come from?
Yeah. I think, it's funny you say that, because that's one of the questions I had for you. What's yet to happen when you're talking about, Rankin, this idea of like the what is, how do we arrive at the what is? How do we know the what is? So in a way, it's sort of self-serving that I, have this question, because I'm trying to reconcile it myself.
Right.
So far, I'm in the sort of discursive field of experimentation, and this is what brings me back to machine learning and generative adversarial networks and so on and so forth. So I want to first sort of assume the capture of Black being as the object in itself. So I'm sort of suspending phenomena. I don't want to dismiss it yet, even though I want to. I just keep it and say, okay, what if we cannot escape this objecthood? Then what then can be the what next? How can I then work through this type of colonial algorithmic process to then attach upon a type of nonlinearity which might indicate some breach and some mode of escape? So I guess to put it another way, when we look underneath a general adversarial network or type of advanced machine learning algorithm, there's several versions. We know that there are moments, even if they're microseconds, of moments which are computable and understood outside of human cognition. Which means it's the first time actually on the planet that there is a process of knowledge, whether that knowledge is human or non-human. There's a process of knowledge which already lives both within and outside of white comprehension.
Right.
And so if the Black object is to I want to see if I can push it into circulation, even for a microsecond, to then think about, I'm not sure if that's my phone. Okay, to even think about what next might be.
Right. So I mean, that's I didn't talk about it here, but I think in some ways that's how I would even respond to the same question in a variant way, and of thinking about the ways in which, at least in the ways in which that Luciana and I have even talked about it in relation to cosmos computation, but literally a way in which of opening up the system, a kind of allopoiesis, toward being open to the very transformative force of the incomputable, of infinities, or of the indeterminacies of Blackness, and the creative indeterminacies of Blackness, for that matter, right? And so what are the ways in which that has the potentiality of opening up toward alternative onto epistemologies, and transforming the very epistemology of the system in and of itself, where currently, as we know and understand it, I mean, especially if I think about it in the context of algorithmic governance, much of the system is is fixed, right? It's actually stuck within a closed system, and in many ways, very much so structured, and has a heavy hand in maintaining the parameters in order to maintain the sort of, we might characterize as the fidelity toward whiteness, the fidelity toward whiteness and colonialist reason within the law and policy and governance. So I mean, I think you know, I think there's a different sort of a variation of a similar sort of response in the direction you're going. I'm so I mean, I've I said this before, but I'm so deeply both intrigued and excited by the way in which you're thinking about and talking about the Black technical object and the ways in which it has its very potentiality in the structure of the technical object. So what it has a potential to do. Yeah.
Which, you know, for me sort of brings back the same problematic, because in a way, you know, if I were to bring a Spectre back, I would bring Fanon back. You know, well, one hopes that he solves his gender and sexuality issues, but also, you know, but also, you know, there's that small paragraph in Black Skin, White Mask in the beginning, and I think it's in Negro language, where he picks up on Freud and structuralism. He's talking about ontogeny and phylogeny, and that's where he introduces sociogeny, and then he just leaves it.
And and moves on. Yep.
And he moves on.
It's like, and he drops the mic real quick, and it goes.
and so I'm wondering, like, if I can exhume anything, you know, if Fanon had lived long enough to where he actually encountered machine learning, as opposed to which is the latest variation of the colonial machine gun, then would that actually, exactly like you're saying, like, would that possibility unfold? I mean, the guy didn't live long enough, but I wonder, like, because I think he was onto something that had yet to be articulated and materialized.
Right. And maybe when he dropped the mic in that brief moment, in that brief line, if you will, it's not even a full paragraph. It's literally like a line.
He just put it.
Right. Let me just get this in here. Maybe he was anticipating winter. Or, you know, and even others who have taken up Winter's articulation of the sociogenic principle, and even anticipating the Ramon Amaro, right? Like, you know, there's a way in which I would almost even situate this within kind of thinking about the haunting in it. So we often think about haunting as a pejorative force, as a negative force, but in some ways, I think there's an affirmative force. There's a generative force in haunting in and of itself, right? And so I think there's a way in which you might even think about sort of the dropping of the mic as the anticipation of, yeah.
Well, I mean, but that's what I appreciate about, you know, your conceptualization and sort of this deconstruction of ontology in itself, because there's several explicit and implicit undertones of the affirmative potential of this. You know, whereas if I go back to Gordon, I think that's why I focus on that quote. It's in between. It's sort of non-committal to what the impact of this is, and so that's why I really appreciate you pulling that out and giving it more space to breathe and say, like, look, this isn't just this, you know, this dusty mummy we're talking about. We're talking about something that actually might be the pathway to the future. And so I really, you know, and I think about that a lot, about that necessity. It's almost like a necessity almost to give room with even the specter of Black study to allow it to breathe in another space. And I see you doing that very well in that article. It's one of my favorites, you know, and being able to, you know, open these kind of new questions. But then where does that leave us? So it's kind of a question for you, like, because you have to recommit to the body, to the individual category.
And no, it's a precisely a deeply important and sharp question. I mean, you know, in some ways where I want to push it is even to think about how we might, I'm thinking McKittrick here, even what's the name of the piece that she has with Hillier as well, but literally the rhythms, the relationalities, the intensities that can then move us toward a kind of what I would characterize as a kind of racializing or racialized affect, a kind of politics, and even new empiricism in a sense that can point us toward alternative directions, alternative ways of becoming, alternative ways of even imagining new futures, if you will, or even shaping, I should say, new futures.
But I mean, that kind of anticipates another question, because I was sort of wondering from your talk if, you know, this kind of proposal, because it sounds like a type of essentialism in a bit, you know, which brings me back to Fanon. I mean, that's why he broke up with negritude. He's like, oh, this is great. Finally, a rhythm. I can understand my blackness through rhythm, but then it requires me to then subsume myself back into the categorical. Is that the only way? Like, maybe that's not a bad thing, you know?
Right. I'm gonna sit on that one. That's a really good question though. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. There's been it's a wonderful dialogue, and I can tell that you can still going on, and this can obviously become a larger conversation for many reasons. But I have a few questions from the audience that I would like to address to you. So the first one is from Tiziana Terranova to Ramon. How do you understand the relation between your notion of the black technical object and technical objects, such as the sound system, for example, which are coded as black?
I think that is, in a way, thank you for that question, because, you know, that sort of question is what sort of began this idea of thinking about this black technical object. You know, it sort of began with this sort of inquiry of how blackness actually transmits. You know, and I'm trying to think beyond this sort of, you know, sociological context of transgenerational type of trauma, but really how blackness transmits itself through life itself. You know, how does one feel and capture blackness, you know, this type of effectual experience, which kind of led me to thinking about, you know, is blackness itself a transmission? It is that, like the sound wave, which flows through the world, which actually carries these pre-individual bodies through the world. And in a way, are we producing blackness much the same way as a speaker is producing sound? Like, is my body, am I just the speaker that's pumping out both black historicity and black life? And then what is the implication of that? And so I think combined with what I just talked about with Ezekiel, I think that's why we kind of wanted to suspend blackness into this object. So kind of take advantage of this colonial makeup here, and then sort of re-articulate it and say, okay, well, maybe it's not an object for whiteness per se, but then it becomes an object that then gets in conversation and becomes allowable for other objects to transmit that which is we call blackness. So I hope that answers a bit of my motivations behind it, but I think it's very much connected.
Thank you. A second question from Kola Hayward wrote me to Ezekiel. From my reading of Speculative of Marx, Derrida's concept of ontology seems to partially be a response to Fukuyama and of history. Derrida rebuttal of neoliberal hegemony, but ontology within media studies, like the kind that Fisher fleshed out, doesn't seem directly tied to that political critique. How do you think we might reconcile these two forms of ontology?
It's a good question. I appreciate this question. So on the one hand, in some ways, I part of what I'm up to in even my interrogation of time and going after time and rethinking time is, in fact, to move toward an end of history, right? So even as a way of even bringing in De Silva's Black feminist poetics of trying to think and even read without the modern categories of time, history, even space, universal in particular and such. And so I think I can't say that I'm fully there in my development on this, but I am trying to move in that direction. I think there's an implicit way. I think you're right. There's a way in which where Mark Fisher doesn't directly go after this, but I think there's an implicit way in which he's going after this. I mean, I do think he is, in fact, there's a complete deconstruction of temporality or time, and even of history, and then through Fisher's work. In fact, much of his articulations is really focused on the virtual, not even a past or a history. It's really much more on a virtual and even a not yet. But I hope this that's my response for now. I hope this answer gives you an adequate answer. But as I said, I'm still working toward this.
Thank you. I have another question. Again, by Sarah El-Taki to Ezekiel. Could you expand on the points regarding the self-regulation, regarding to self-regulation, recursive colonialism, and recursive thinking? Thank you.
Yeah, so I appreciate this question as well. So, I think I would argue that fundamentally recursion has, particularly recursion in a closed system, is fundamentally about self-regulation, maintaining the changing same, if you will, and so through that, as we think about how the recursive systems are literally engaging in the changing same of colonialist reason, the ways in which we could think about this through history, or we can think about this in and through the developments of technologies that are recursive systems. The ways in which the liberal subject, the post-enlightenment subject, the transparent subject is designed into the very system and becomes part of the very self-regulating of that liberal subject in and of itself, maintaining the very epistemology of the liberal or transparent subject. So even in the face of the racial over, even in the face of difference, even in the face of indeterminacies, the system is designed in such a way to recursively regenerate the very transparent subject that it's been designed on. Now, where recursive thinking comes in is once temporality is situated, once a temporal process becomes part of the recursive system, literally temporality in and of itself becomes a form of epistemology that enables a kind of recursive thinking. Okay, so the ways in which the system is updating enables a form of recursive knowing. Yeah, I'll stop on there.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting question that one could follow on. Let's see if we have time for a little chat at the end. Another question from an anonymous to both speakers. Does the becoming process of the present define a becoming that is not continuous but disjuncted? And if so, does it mean that there are two distinct modes of time and space? This is a question to both. So maybe Ramon, would you like to start?
Just really quickly, I think this is a really interesting and very fun question, actually. And I know we don't have time to unfold it fully, but you know, in a way, to accept a sort of multivalent idea of individuation is to accept that there is an infinite amount of possibilities and connections and relations that are reciprocally influencing each one of those individuations. And by the time we arrive here, is what we see as coherence is just the amplification of all of those tensions. And so part of the problem that Simone, as we know, is trying to illustrate is when we look upon both the form of our bodies as well as history and time and space, we see it as a continuous strand. We see it as a continuity. And this is, I think, what Ezekiel's picking up on. He wants to dismantle history, you know, that perception of this continuity, when in actuality, it is defined by its disjunction. It's defined by its dissonance, and it's defined by that which enacts our alienation. So in that way, that alienation becomes the signal of the discontinuity, which then would enable us to access another distinct. So that's the point of thought that I'm working with, that enables us to enact another distinct mode of space and time. So not to get all sci-fi on us here, but maybe we should talk about a bit of Afrofuturism. But if we are to accept that that's the past that leads to the present, then we also prompted to accept that timeline of space and time in which we perceive is already infused with multiple timelines. And so it becomes impossible to actually say, who am I? Because they're only a fraction of you that's comprehensible at any given time. You never actually see your complete self in any given mode. So that would then imply that this sort of distinct mode of time and space. But I don't think that's a mode of panic. I think that's a mode of potential, because it then it allows us to breach these sort of very hard walls, as Ezekiel is saying, in order to even just peek over to see another possibility.
Ramon articulated that much better than I can. I think the only thing I appreciate actually what your response. I think the only thing I'm going to add to it is, in fact, if we think about it as sort of some past A that then leads to some becoming process of B and C, the past A is imminent in the becoming process of B and C, but not in any universal or even singular way. In fact, there's a discontinuity even in the very becoming processes between B and C, despite them sharing the same imminent path. And so on the one hand, I think there's a way in which one can think about sort of the discontinuities or the disjunctures of temporality in the perception of the not yet, or even the anticipation of the not yet, or even the perception of the no longer. But I also think there's a way in which even within the same, those that are inheriting the heirs of the same imminent past are also engaging in a fractured or disjunctured becoming process in and of itself. But I'm just, as a way to add on to even what Ramon already nicely articulated.
I just would like to make a comment, if I may, because I guess to both of you, it's interesting the way you are thinking about this it's almost like a multiverse mode of temporality. Where things are parallel and nonetheless they are never the same. So the logic of sameness and difference in terms of recursive repetition doesn't really work, because or in a way is at its limit, because it's not that each temporal space-time is recursively regenerating this kind of pre-individuation to individuation, but actually there is a way in which whatever you change in one word will be changed in another word. So there is always a sense of causality, which is, of course, we can talk about the fact that there is a causality which is at the same time admit more than one form, or more than one possibility of action. But on the other hand, it also allows the fact that these two distinct modes of time and space kind of communicate with each other and transform each other. So there is a sense in which, for instance, when Fred Moten talks about the break, that the break, this rupture, that it's it comes from the recursivity, but the other hand impacts back on the recursivity. So in that way, as some kind of political validity. And yeah, I was just thinking about the way you replied. That seems quite interesting to think in terms of where the break happens in this kind of parallel universes, this kind of different distinct claim to temporality and the materiality of it. So that was just an interesting way. You just got me to think. So just
thank you. I mean, can I make a quick comment on that? Because as you were talking, I was thinking of Octavia Butler's Kindred. As that moment of, it goes from that moment of the recognition of the past and goes into a hyperstition. But then there was that pinnacle moment where the cost of that was, she had to leave her arm behind. And so, and kind of as you're kind of saying that, this kind of multiverse, I think with, for me, with the body of difference, it always comes at a type of cost. And to me, it's that cost that becomes that specter of the past. It's basically that limb that has to be sacrificed in order to traverse to another type of parallel existence.
Yeah, and actually I have a question here for you, Ramon, which seems to continue this point. How do you see a black technical object as similar to quantum computing?
Well, I mean, I kind of feel like you already answered that. not to bounce it off here, but I think I can't fully articulate it in the same way that Luciana has, but it's sort of the direction that I'm going to is thinking about then this, I think is what I was trying to say before about the black technical objects engagement with nonlinear type of computational systems, is because they already kind of provide a pathway in which to think nonlinearly. And so if I were to submit this kind of black object into it, not to recognize that which I already know whiteness will misrecognize me. So if I actually subvert the shock of that and then allow the black object to go through this type of multivalent experience, then what might unfold? How might a new relation then build? But then also recognizing that, this isn't something that we're talking about complete freedom. This complete subversion, because these layers will then fold onto themselves and become, knots in different intensities, so and so forth. And I think that's why, for me, it's important to think about the black technical object also as a psychic individuation, so that if it traverses the multiverse, these types of multiverses, and encounters the familiar anxiety of its subjection, then it already can tap into the tools to then maintain a pathway to chart. So it becomes that, and that's where I kind of go back to Moten, as you're saying, Luciana, within the break, is constantly accessing that breach.
Thank you, Ramon. I have another question for Ezekiel from Anonymous. Could you speak more to the concept of diffraction in relation to Rankin's quote around feelings that don't sit comfortably in the community?
Feelings that don't fit comfortably within the community.
Don't sit. Feelings that don't sit.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this is a great question. I mean, I had not necessarily thought about diffraction in relation to ranking, but I think it's a great way of even putting them in conversation. So I mean, diffraction, it's, as I mentioned, as Barad talks about, it's a overlapping wave patterns, and in particular when an obstruction or some kind of diffractive apparatus produces multiple different waves and in these overlapping waves. And I think there's a way in which we might think about, in Ranking's quote, or even the passage from that prose, how there's something in that event one might characterize as a racialized event, a racialized encounter, but there's something in that event, a form of violence that is enacted, that then is that then produces what I would characterize as diffractive patterns of even how there is that very situation, that very event is experienced. So literally, you have this one person who's even questioning, "Am I experiencing this the same? Am I is what I'm feeling even? Is it ridiculous?" And so that there's a sense in which even there's a sense in which even that one is in experiencing a kind of disorienting experience of the disjuncture, if you will, of the conceptual the conceptual prehension or even perception of even the event in and of itself. And as such, then is producing differences that make a difference, right? So this particular person is even engaging in a desire that's already slipping in their grasp, and what I'm characterizing as a future's past. Yeah, I think that's.
Thank you, Ezekiel. Thank you very much. There's another question for Ramon from Jessica Edwards. If blackness and the technical black object might be conceived as transmission, I'm thinking here Oishmael Reed Mambo Jumbo and the Jess Grew virus, how and in what forms might this differ from contagion? If this is so, how do we circumvent a further descent into an essentialism where blackness, its creative exists, is haunted, is again to be eradicated and or contained?
Thank you for that very complicated question. That's quite intense, and actually it's quite interesting for me because it sort of leads to a trajectory of thinking about the black technical object, and the reason why is thinking about those terms together between contagion and transmission, because contagion requires a type of contact, it requires an event. So you have this sort of ethereal machinic mechanism that then comes into contact, or an object comes into contact with another object, and then it's transmitted in that way. This was the sort of problem that Du Bois worked through with race contact and his picking up from Hegel. This was also what Fanon was working through, is this point of contact from the racialized body into the psychosocial colonial body. As a psychiatrist, he was very much interested in this exact moment, but it was a pinnacle moment because what he realized is that the power of colonialism and the power of whiteness did not require direct contact to actually transmit itself through. So he sort of extended Du Bois in that way. And so I want to think of transmission even extending it further in a Simondian sense, which doesn't require that contact. So if blackness is a transmission, it's not something that is in the ether, in the milieu, that gets captured by the individual in a uniform type of manner. I mean, that is colonialism and whiteness. That's its attempt. But when we see the production of blackness, much as Tiziana's question about thinking about the role of music, and I think of Julian Henrichs in this way too. When I'm thinking about blackness as a transmission, I'm talking about the excesses of the functioning of black social life, which then actually get produced and put out into the milieu, not for the purposes of capture, but for the purposes of production in itself. And so that's how I sort of see the difference. And so it doesn't become an essentialism per se, it becomes that which one can then rely on when, as Ezekiel is saying, is this ground underneath is completely disjointed, and actually everything is sort of like an earthquake, is sort of falling apart in terms of race. That transmission becomes that which doesn't direct one to be black, but allows one to access a multiverse of blackness and the wisdoms and life and things that sort of come with that. So I hope that answers.
Thank you very much, Ramon. I have another question from Goda Glabite. I hope I spell your name well, to both. I understand you well. No, if I understand you well, both of your work thinks with NLO on computing. However, as Ezekiel noted, a lot of algorithmic governance in AI is normatively reproducing white colonial structures. I wonder whether in your practice you work with computer scientists and whether I wonder whether in your practice you work with computer scientists and whether you would envision ways of how thinking with Black critical thought and computation may be done within informatics.
So I'll start. So thank you for this question, a really interesting one. In fact, one that I'll say we, being a sort of a general sort of critical computation bureau, we is also often thinking about and wanting to invite and bring on board engagements and conversations with computer scientists, information scientists, and statisticians and all. I should state up front that my PhD is in psychometrics, so I do have the measurement and statistics background and do statistical modeling and teach it and all. Though part of the wrestles that I engage in my own work is a rethinking of quantification in alternative terms and under alternative ontoepistemologies. Now, when I'm characterizing quantification in this sense, I'm really much of the way in which I think about it is with regard to measurement and even statistical modeling. Computation, I think, is there's a sort of a distinct sort of process that's at play, and while on the one hand, I have my desires of working with computer scientists and information scientists and with a particular kind of question, as you pose here, of trying to bring Black critical thought into computation, that I can't say that I'm doing that as of yet, although I am currently working with some computer scientists with two computer scientists, one of computational linguistics, where we're engaging in questions around, let me retract that actually. As I'm thinking further through this, I'm actually not giving a completely accurate response. I am actually engaged in these questions with computer scientists. In fact, one in which is a computational linguist, and another one is actually a theorist of machine learning, in particular, we're in thinking through questions in the context of education and learning analytics and educational systems, or data-driven educational systems. How might critical, for instance, critical race theory, or even Black feminist thought be brought to bear in thinking through the questions of the equitable and questions of process and the shaping of difference and the shaping of even what I would of inequitable experiences within the context of these systems. So, long way of answering the question, but yes.
I think, for me, I think if you would have asked me this question about 2 years ago, then I would have invited you to one of those multiculturalism rooms, from the 90s, where everyone gets in the room and hashes it out. But I think if 2020 has taught us anything, it is that one of the problems of whiteness is that they don't know they're white. And one of the problems of engineering is that they're bound by either the symbolic categorization of the assumption itself, so they're bound by the languages of mathematics and code, or they're bound by capitalism. And then, of course, ethical AI and data bias, digital humanities have been done a lot of substantial work in trying to get them to see that these things are, as Ezekiel called it, as the algorithmo, that these techno-social assemblages are already combined, but there's a certain type of psychic refusal in that space and requires a lot of dismantling and perceptual dismantling. I think there's a matter of urgency that circumvents, once again, the role of the body of color to educate that which is wielding the power, to recognize their own power. And I've sort of, at this point, am more interested in thinking about the role of the Black artist, the Black aesthetic, this Black aesthetician, you know, the one that's producing another world, you know, the Afrofuturist, the Xenofuturist, the feminist futurism, you know, those that are actually seeking to construct new worlds, to enact in world making, and to build something else, and then how they are articulating these modes that might be in concert with new iterations of technology, but might not. I'm not saying that it's not a substantial job. I'm not saying that it's not necessary to engage with computer science to enact certain types of change. But I think that if this year has proven anything, the type of change that we need is going to require a radical upheaval of our own perceptual frameworks. And I don't think I'm willing anymore to start from the presupposition of compromise with computer science.
So Ramon, I have to ask a question and follow up. Is there a potential sort of slippage of a disciplinary essentialism that you're articulating here? And is there a way in which we might be able to think beyond the kind of staticness or even almost what almost sounds like a kind of rigid paradigmatic boundary making of the disciplines to think, you know, alternatively? Is there not some kind of potentiality to work with here?
You know, there is a lot of potentiality. I won't say that, you know, I won't say that it's not there. I mean, you know, as an engineer myself, I was a different kind of engineer, but, you know, this is a function that's beyond the intervention of ethics. I mean, this has to do with education policy and what's on the curriculum. This has to do with, it has to do with capital expansion, what's employable, all these things. There is no benefit right now for the computer scientists to actually take on board what is actually being proposed strongly, other than their own desires to transmit, to transcend what has already been done. And I think what I'm saying is, I don't want to contribute to the future of Blackness all on the presupposition that, on the fragility of someone's personal claim to change. See, that's why it rings as multiculturalism to me. Because it's not, what's not going to change is the capital expansion. What's not going to change, if someone like Google is developing a new type of mathematics, it's only for the purposes of the capital expansion of Google. It's not for the purposes of the expansion of knowledge in itself. So then to ask them to intervene in this messiness that we call race, that's why I started with the provocative statement about, whiteness recognizing whiteness. Like, I don't think after hundreds of years of fantastic Black work that I want to put everything that has been done, I don't want to put the stakes of that work on a computer scientist. I'm not saying anything against computer science, because I love this technology, I do. I'm not saying it, but I think it's unfair to put it on them. And maybe that's a more generous statement. It's unfair to put that burden on them as if they're the ones who need the perceptual shift. It relinquishes all of our relational responsibilities to then enact a more universal mode of perception. So that's a bit more generous than.
No, but in some ways, sort of, in my question is to ask you to account for our own being. Right? You coming out of engineering, myself coming out of psychometrics, literally about background in statistics, right? So how do we come to even any kind of articulation that we're engaging in right now? And in what ways does that even point toward a potential opening for others? So maybe we need to send a raft for rescue.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think, if anything, engineering and computer science and psychometrics, I mean, they're good at producing humanities scholars, because a lot of people escape. So maybe it's actually not a bad, brushing up against the limitations of it. And of course, I talk all of this mad smack right now, and then I'm going to go right on to get onto my technical devices. So, absolute hypocrite in application. But I think that, I think that intervention is, because part of my worry, Ezekiel, part of my worry is, I'm a dinosaur. When I was in engineering, all the Silicon Valley bros were in the basement. They weren't allowed to talk to anybody. And now that dynamic has switched, and where they're in the boardroom and everyone else is sort of in the basement. You know, I believe in the sort of contingency of the world, so I don't want to act as if that is the only formation that will solidify in this world. And we can't anticipate the next form of power if we're trying to focus on just this amplification that we've seen over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt, but we have a few questions that I would like to squeeze in. So one is by Martina Tazzioli to Ramon. Could you explain a bit more on how you use Simondon and Fanon together? I understand that for Fanon, alienation is not an individual question, but does it mean that it is pre-individual? In other words, what does Simondon analysis enable us to see of Fanon?
Read the book. No, it's kidding. No, actually, this is one of the questions I'm trying to work out in the book. And I'm thinking about, actually, this is where I get into the circulation of discourse. Because, you know, in close readings, especially of Black Skin, White Mask, you know, I'm going to sort of pick up on what Simone Brown has been very strong about, this relationship between Fanon and, you know, and Foucault. And, you know, she's identified, of course, that Foucault was attending Fanon's lectures, and, you know, in some senses, I've heard her say, you know, even refuse to use Foucault, will just use Fanon. And the reason for that is in that school of thought at the time, it was highly parasitic, with an influence of discourse back and forth. And I'm not saying that Simondon has come into contact with Fanon, but if we read through Black Skin, White Mask and read it in parallel, this is what I'm actually doing in parts of the book, and read it in parallel with Simondon, what happens is the emergence of similar types of thought. And those similar types of thought, of course, enact themselves in different ways. And one of these ways is what the point of alienation and what it serves. See, for Fanon, alienation is in that direct conversation with Marx. So it's for streamlining with, you know, with Derrida, and enacts itself a certain different way. However, for Simondon, alienation performs a different type of function, as you already sort of recognize, which gives a different type of visibility to that iteration of the self. And so really what I want to do is, as I was saying before about exhuming Fanon in this specter, I want to kind of think about, if he were to re-articulate this alienation in more of a Simondian type of way, then what would a discourse of colonialism become? What would a discourse of racialization become? One that is not so much dependent upon, because you can't, you know, he can't break from the Hegelian dialectic. He can't break from the Marxist alienation and the Merleau-Pontian type of perception. And so what if he were to actually realize that break, which I believe Simondon has done with the trans individual, and especially the trans individual's relationship to alienation. So I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. I have another question from both of you. It's by Brian Aquino. It's a long question, so I'm going to go to the end because I have another question that I also would like to ask, bring forward to you. So if algorithmic noise is the diffraction or the skipping, haunting, is the operational logic of preemptive capitalism, to what extent it is and remains black, and how does its blackness get amplified and weaponized? It's drawing from Mark Fisher, also link of ontology, contemporary electronic music and capital. Shall I repeat, Ezekiel? Yeah, so if algorithmic noise is the diffraction or the skipping, haunting, the operational logic of preemptive capitalism, to what extent it is and remains black? How does its blackness get amplified and weaponized?
So this is a good question, Brian. Thank you. I don't have a response for this yet. Let me think about this for a moment.
Okay, in the meantime, Ramon, do you want to say something? Maybe
Can we repeat the question? Just so
sorry, my reader. Noise is the diffraction or the skipping?
If noise is
the diffraction and the skipping.
Diffraction or the skipping.
Which is haunting the operational logic of preemptive capitalism. If noise is what is haunting the operational logic, to what extent algorithmic noise is and remains black? And how does its blackness get amplified and weaponized? Sorry, what's my reading?
Yeah, I think that's a, it's a highly complex question. Of course, there's resonances of Fisher that are in that. I think that, I guess first I would like to respond to think about the ontological starting point, even to consider noise and what noise actually might mean. And here I kind of want to pick up on Michelle Wallace and Evelyn Hammond's, idea when they think about Black feminism as always being attached to the void, to that which is deviant, to that which actually is in disjunction with a type of normality. And so I think the first thing I would say is the answer would be very much dependent upon the conception of noise. If noise is that which articulates a state of being that is not necessarily in continuity with predominant modes of being, aka whiteness, then perhaps the body of difference functions in that space. But the risk there is then relegating a type of essentialism where that body of difference can only circulate in this type of breach of a normality. So I think if I were to take an affirmative psychic individuation, I would sort of prefer it the other way around, where noise doesn't become the break in which identifies the discontinuity in that kind of parasitic kind of way. I would prefer to see, if we were to see Blackness as noise, I would prefer to see noise as the normality and totality itself, and then that which becomes comprehensible, which would be the continuity of, say, music and sound, that would be the identification of a normalized system, which I think, could sort of bring me into Julian Hendricks about, when he's talking about dub in Jamaica, it's not necessarily the sound, it's the affect that is in relationship to both material objects and the sound itself that activates the body to move. So if that's the noise, then I think that's what I would be interested in.
This is it is a complicated question. I appreciate your response, Ramon. I think I want to point toward in the ways in which it depends on even, so on the one hand, if we're thinking about this algorithmically, then the very, how would I put it? The context in which it's actually even enfolding that which is even constituted as even Blackness in this context. But I also want to think about this in relation to even organic bodies, in the sense of the ways in which the extent to which Blackness remains also has every bit to do with the ways in which the individual is enfolding the very conceptual perception, if you will, of that which is what we might characterize as even the racialized encounter. I'm not sure if that even helps even go in that direction, but yeah, I have to sit on this one and process it more. Yeah.
It's my fault. It's a long question, so we will send it to you. It's got a nice long preamble for this, which I skipped for questions of time. Sorry, Brian. We have another couple of questions. I have a question for Ezekiel. in the 90s, collectives in the UK, such as Mongrel Media, experimented with Photoshop-like modification, which added and subtracted race and class, etc. What kind of difference do you think the use of generative GAN, and machine learning makes to all the techniques such as Photoshop-like techniques that are still at work in apps, for example?
It's unfortunate. I don't know enough about Photoshop to even, the technology and even the logics around behind Photoshop to even speak to its differences and distinctions between that and GAN for that matter. So I don't feel like I can really give an adequate response to this.
Okay. I have another question to Ramon from Steve Goodman. Can I ask Ramon to elucidate a bit more on the point he made at the end regarding Fanon, rhythm, and essentialism?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's a very important question, and one that sort of brings me back to kind of the history of art. So maybe it's becoming a bit more coherent while I'm in that, with my research while I'm in that department. So I'm sort of referring back to the significance of the recapturing of the diasporan subject that emerged through negritude, which of course came through different types of aesthetics, sound, painting, poetry, so on and so forth, and leaned heavily on thinking about re-articulating the myth and the stereotype and returning to a type of origin. Whereas the object in itself, whether that's the sonic object of, the sound wave, or whether it's the wooden sculpture, where the object itself already contains the rhythm of this type of Black essence. It contains the rhythm of this culture. And of course, this is a direct critique to the Western art institution, which is taking these anthropological notions of, taking these artifacts or depicting Black life in the global South as something that's sort of static, as a spectacle that should be on exhibition and display. Whereas as we know, negritude is trying to re-articulate that, recapture Blackness, and in doing so aligns very heavily with a type of Pan-Africanism. Where it becomes in conflict is, what we know has emerged in art history in the 80s and 90s is this really recognition that essentialism that emerges from going down to an essence of Black origin becomes exclusive in itself and starts to replicate the same issues. And of course, specifically, I'm talking about then what is the role of the Black trans body? What is the role of gender? What is the role of sexuality, ableism, all this sort of what we consider the body of difference, because it then depends upon everyone tapping into that single rhythm. And I think it's related to the other question about transmission. And so that connection with Fanon, it became kind of a counter response, because, Fanon on one side is finally finds something where he can celebrate his Blackness as something affirmative, but then it becomes counter to his strategy, which is to create this radical humanism, which then requires both people of color and non-people of color to completely shift their perspective, their visual perception. So you basically can't attach to essentialism of origin and then subvert that origin at the same time. He saw it kind of as a replication of white colonialism. And that's a kind of tension there. I think when we think of rhythm, there's been so much scholarship since then. And if this is the Steve, I think it is, you contributed to this idea of rethinking what rhythm itself might mean. And so in a way, it's like it needs a type of revision, because I don't think it's that simple anymore. I don't know if you can take a negritudian type of rhythm and therefore a Fanonian type of rhythm, and then it would apply to the type of study with rhythm we would do today. But I'm more so interested in what would happen if we were to take that conceptualization of rhythm today and insert it back into negritude, or even insert it back into Fanon. Then what can we learn from those types of specters? Yeah. But I actually would be interested in hearing what you have to say about it, to be honest.
Thank you very much. And on this note, I want to thank, I think we're gonna start wrapping up and actually start saying our goodbyes. Thank you very much to Ezekiel and Ramon for the, endearing, never-ending conversation that have been developing over the years. And I guess this is just one of the many other times in which one comes together and unfolds so much rich, difficult as well, way of rethinking the relation between Blackness, racialization, technology, time. So I'm super grateful that you guys give us this time and shared your idea, and I'm sure that this is all work in progress. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. So thank you, Ramon. Thank you, Ezekiel. Thank you, Oana and Brian. I just would like to say that we see you tomorrow at the same time for episode 04, entitled Machine Aesthetics and Science Fiction Capital. Thank you very much for being with us, to all the attendees and the participants. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.